spent our first week talking about our Creator God, amazing God who creates everything, created man, woman. And then last time we were together, we were introduced to our enemy, Satan. And I'm kind of an oddball around here. I like to not focus on the enemy, but I think it's important that we as Christians realize what we're dealing with, what we're up against. So last week when we looked at Satan, we established that he was a fallen angel, but he's under God's authority. He's always rebelling. He is always aspiring for God's position. He is a tempter. He is a deceiver. And Satan is determined to distort, thwart, or destroy the things of God. This is really important, guys. As we roll along through the Old Testament and we read a lot of crazy stories. I had a guy from church this week give me a call. We spent about an hour on the phone, and he was asking about some very specific things in the Old Testament law and the breaking of that law and specific stories about that. And we find that it's humanity's sin, yes, but also there's an enemy who's constantly trying to destroy the way we think and keeping God first and keeping him central in our lives. And it's always been this way. From Adam and Eve all the way to today, we have enemies, if you will, with the fallen angels who seek more than anything to destroy that good thing which God has created. God loves us, the enemy hates us. And we see that all the way through. And so we learned about the deliverer was going to come, right? Genesis 3, what? 15. All right, you guys are getting good. Genesis 3:15. I'm calling that the football, okay? As we read the Old Testament, we want to see the football go down the field. And we will. We can trace the football. And the crazy thing is, with every moment you see God take steps in getting everything to Jesus in the New Testament, you can see the enemy doing everything he can to stop that, to try to thwart that, to try to destroy that. And this is nonetheless. So tonight we're starting with Noah. We find that it's been 15 years of sin-filled darkness that we run into a man named Noah. And if you can imagine how wicked people had become because God takes drastic action. The first thing you see in your book is God's response to man's wickedness. The first thing is that God would destroy unrepentant people. This shows us how much God hates and despises sin. Genesis 6:7. So the Lord said, I will blot man whom I have created from the face of the land, animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. I love that last sentence. I wish we could go into a 20-minute little aside on that, but we're going to keep moving forward. God destroys, he hates sin. Number 2, God would spare the righteous, this being Noah and his family. Verse 8, it says, Noah found favor or grace in the eyes of the Lord. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. Again, Noah was born a sinner, like everyone else, under Satan's control, like all of Adam's descendants. And Noah responded to God and agreed with God that he was a sinner deserving of death. Hebrews 11:7 says, by faith, Noah being warned by God concerning the events as yet unseen, in reverent fear, constructed an ark for the saving of his household. And by this he condemned the world and became an heir of righteousness that comes by faith. We see that Noah would have followed the line of Adam. Remember, Cain didn't do what he was supposed to. Cain should have sacrificed an animal. Cain brought part of his crops in. Noah would have been a man who sacrificed to God, just as Adam would have taught following generations. And Noah was trusting in God to save him. And here's the thing we said a lot when we were doing the journey. The question that people ask all the time is, how are people in the Old Testament saved? We look back toward Jesus, what he has done in our behalf. The deliverer had come. But what about all those people before Christ? And so we say we look back, but everyone before Christ looked forward. Their faith is that God would fulfill his promise and send a deliverer. So Noah had faith. God told him to make a sacrifice. God said that he was going to send a deliverer, so Noah had that faith. Firm Foundation says this is how God treats those who agree with him and depend on him to make them acceptable to him. God saves those who deserve to be punished. He saves them because of his grace. The third thing is God would use a constructed ark to spare Noah and his family from the coming flood. Verse 13, Genesis chapter 6. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark out of gopher wood. And I imagine Noah's like, what's an ark? Right? Famous line from Bill Cosby. There was to be only one ark, only one way by which people could be saved from God's wrath. In addition, the ark was to have only one door through which anyone could enter. Every person, every animal was to be saved from God's wrath would have to enter the ark through this one door. And see this pattern. People are like, God is a completely different God in the Old Testament, a completely different God in the New Testament. It has always been one way. It always been the promise of the deliverer. And when the deliverer came, we put our faith in him. And this is stretched all the way out through Genesis through Revelation, all the way to our time today. Noah was a tremendous example of faith. First thing is he believed God's words, even when he may not have understood everything. Verse 22 in chapter 6 says, Noah did this and did all that God had commanded him. Noah had never seen rain. Noah believed there would be a flood because he trusted God's words. Noah was an example of faith because he entered the ark before it even rained. So he made this great thing. It's a massive structure. And then he went in as God had told him. Not only did he go in, but he entrusted God with the safety of his family. What a big step of faith. Having never seen rain, the big thing you just built, what in the world? You have all these animals in it, and God's like, all right, through that door, take you and your family, go on in there. And then God shut the door. Verse 16 said, all those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. The final thing, the example of faith that he has, he believed God would judge all those on the outside of the ark. The flood continued for 40 days on the earth. The waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. And all flesh died that moved in the earth, birds, livestock, beasts, the swarming creatures that swarm the earth, all mankind. Everything on dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, and animals and creeping things and birds of heavens. God's really trying to be really clear here how much destruction really happened. and they were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left and those who were with him in the ark. Why did everyone else have to die? Because they refused to believe God. They refused to follow him. And here's the question. In what ways are most people today like those who died in the flood? Most people today refuse to believe God. They love their sin, and they don't agree with God that they may be wrong. It's a pattern that started all the way back, and we're facing it all the way today. Next, we're going to see God's covenant with Noah. First thing is that God established Noah's worship. There are quite a few different covenants in the Bible. First one we didn't get to mention our first week here, but the first one we call the Adamic covenant. That is the covenant that God made with humanity. When we come to Noah, God reaffirms his covenant with Noah. Genesis, I believe it's 6:18 says, "But I will establish my covenant with you. You will enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you." If you want to trace back the Adamic covenant, it's Genesis chapter 1 through 3, very specifically focused on chapter 1, verses 26 through 31, and chapter 2, verses 15 through 17. So God reestablishes the covenant that he made with Abraham. We see that Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and birds and offered a burnt offering to the Lord on the altar. And we see that God also reestablished man's dominion over the earth. If you remember that there's a dominion that God placed on Adam and Eve when he created them. Chapter 9, verse 1, "And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, upon the birds of the heavens, upon everything that creeps in the ground and all the fish in the sea. Into your hand they are delivered.'" And if you want to see how closely this follows that Adamic covenant, you can trace that to Genesis 1, 28 and 29. Very similar language, almost exact. And the final marker of God's covenant is that God promises not to destroy the earth by a global flood again. Chapter 9, verse 15 says, "I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature on the earth. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. And when the bow in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all the flesh that is in the earth." That's a really important thing, that bow, that rainbow. We have people in our culture today who try to take that over, but that is God's marker. If you don't believe me, you can check out Revelation chapter 4, verses 2 and 3, and you see the throne of God. And what circles the throne of God? The rainbow. It's God's marker, God's power, God's glory. And remember, there's someone who's always trying to warp, thwart, and destroy God's plan. So, you guys did some good reading. Noah had 3 sons. Somebody shout out. What's his 3 sons? You guys are awesome. Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So, if those who can cheat a little bit, who is of the line of Jesus? Which one? Shem. Very good. So we're going to jump all the way to Abraham, all right? Flip over to the next page, a man called Abraham. So who was Abraham? Abraham was a descendant of Noah's son Shem and the son of Terah. We get into Genesis chapter 11. It says, now these are the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran fathered Lot. So we find out that he is a descendant directly from Shem's line. We see that he's the husband of Sarai. Now, if you were reading, hopefully you did your reading in the Seamless book, but she closes off, I believe it's chapter 1 or day 1 or 2. In the midst of there, she talks about how Abraham said that Sarah was his sister, right? And then she ends with a sentence like, partially true. Did anybody trace that out and see what happened? Where'd that come from? What she was talking about? I traced it out for you guys. If you follow that into Genesis chapter 20, verses 11 and 12, you find out that Sarah was Abraham's half-sister. Same father, different mother. And so it was a half-truth that he told. He's the husband of Sarai. He lived in Ur, traveling to Canaan, and settled in Haran. Chapter 11, verse 31, it says, Terah took Abraham, his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai, the daughter-in-law, and his son Abram's wife. And they went forth together from Ur, the Chaldees, to go to the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. This is not a small trip, all right? I listened to a lot of podcasts. I was listening to Janet Parshall. And she says, if you think of the Middle East, especially the area of Israel, look at your right hand. If you put your finger right about here, that's where Jerusalem is. And she says, you can trace the Middle East. So you can trace that they started out here, traveled up and over here, and Haran's up here, Ur the Chaldees down here. And I was looking at the map, and I heard her say that. And I'm like, okay. And I put my hand on the map, and I'm like, that's kind of cool. And I noticed she does that a lot when she's talking about the Middle East. And she's like, right about your second knuckle, that's where God's doing the work today. And I'm like, that's kind of cool. But they traveled 1,000 miles from Ur to Haran. Terah led them from Ur to Haran. They spent about 5 years in that time. And then they went 600 miles from Haran to Jerusalem. How would God use Abraham in his plan? How is God going to use Abraham to take that football down the field? First thing is we see that God made himself known to Abraham. Genesis 12:1, and the Lord said to Abraham. No Bible, no written word. God speaks directly to Abraham. And here's the thing, Abraham's family were most likely just pagans. Joshua chapter 24, verse 12, it says, long ago your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham, lived beyond the Euphrates River, and they worshipped other gods. So we have to understand this, is that God did not choose Abraham based on any of his merits. There was nothing good or awesome over Abraham than any other people. God chose Abraham because God says, him. I get to heaven, I want to ask God why him, but that was God's plan, and God was doing what he was planning on doing. Nothing in Abraham's merit. Number 2 is God wanted Abram to completely realign his life. Not much different to our own lives when we follow Christ. Chapter 12, verses 1, and the Lord said to Abram, go from your country, your kindred, and your father's house to a land I will show you. You see, God's plan for Abram could not have been achieved while continuing to live with his idolatrous countrymen. Abram had to leave his hometown and go to the country which God promised to guide him. Obedience, faith, foundation to what's going on here. Number 3, God was keeping his promise to send a deliverer. Remember, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, but you shall bruise his heel. So you better believe when God called Abram, the enemy was watching. The enemy wanted to stop him. The enemy wanted to catch attention. So we're going to move on to the promises. God made 3 promises to Abram. These are very important. Taking that ball further down the field, God makes a covenant with Abram. In Genesis 12:1, Lord said to Abraham, leave your country, your native country, your relatives, your family, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous. You will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. All families on earth will be blessed through you. Here's the thing, 3 things. He promised land, nation, leader. The other way you can say that, land, nation, and the blessing. All the families of the earth will be blessed through you. Who's that blessing? That was weak. Who's that great blessing that was promised? Jesus. There we go. Richard's got it. That's all that matters. There you go. He made the promise of land. Go to the land I will show you. This land would position them as a group of witnesses on the crossroads of the ancient world and as an example of what God can do in the life of this nation. That's huge. If you take a look at where God positioned them, use your hand here. All that's above and all that's below, anybody who wanted to travel to that known world had to travel through God's people. It is no wonder he gave them the laws and all that he gave them, because he wanted them to be set apart and to be different and to be examples of him to every single nation. What a powerful thing. What a crazy thing that God would expect his followers to be an example and point the rest of the world to him. Not so far off to what we're called to do today. The promise of land, the promise of a nation. I will make you a great nation. A nation that would tell the whole world about a coming deliverer. All kinds of people today in our culture complain about the law. But if you can imagine being in Israel at that time, this promised deliverer, why are you doing the things? And I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm getting ahead. Where's Moses coming? We'll hit a little bit of him tonight. All these people are like, why can't you eat? Why are you dressing weird? Why aren't you following our customs? And they could say, that's because we follow a God who makes promises. A God who said that one day a deliverer will come and we follow him and he is our authority. How similar it is to us that we follow the promises of God and we follow the deliverer who died for us. The promise of a deliverer, all nations of the earth would be blessed through Christ. Galatians 3:8 says the scriptures look forward to this time when God would make the Gentiles right in his sight because of their faith. God proclaimed this good news to Abraham long ago when he said, all nations will be blessed through you. The most important promise to Abraham was, and all you, the families of the earth will be blessed. All nations would be blessed through the deliverer who would be Abram's descendant. Next couple of, I'm going to pull you out of the book. You're going to flip over. I'm going to have you flip over. You want to continue on notes. It's not going to be right here exactly, but you can flip over to page 16 to a blank page if you want to keep taking in-depth notes. If not, no worries. I just want to let you know I'm steering away from what you have listed here in the book. We're going to talk about Abraham's response to God's promises. He believed God's words. Genesis 12:4. So Abraham went as the Lord told him, and Lot went with him. And we're going to see In Genesis 15:5, here, this is awesome, listen. And he brought him outside and said, look toward the heavens. Number the stars, if you're able to number them. And then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. Here's the big step of faith. And he, Abraham, believed the Lord, and he, God, counted it to him as righteousness. The descendants seemed impossible to Abraham. Why? He wasn't a spring chicken. All right, we'll just say it that way. He was a little more on the seasoned side of life. And it's no wonder. You guys read in the Seamless book, what did Sarah do when she heard that she was going to have a baby? Laughed. Yeah. Right. Okay. I've never heard of that happening in this age of my life, but okay, we'll see. But Abraham believed what God said, even though it seemed impossible. And based on Abraham believing God's word, God counted him. God made him righteous. When Abraham puts his trust in God, specifically in God's promise to him, the descendants leading to Messiah, God created and counted this belief in Abraham's account as righteousness. So let's flip back to 14. There are two types of righteousness. Martin Luther calls it active and passive righteousness. For our time tonight, we're going to call righteousness, number one, accomplished by our own efforts. Or number two, righteousness accounted to us by the work of God by faith. I was reading last week in Matthew chapter 19, 16 through 22, and there's an amazing story. I encourage you to follow this trail. It's a story of the rich young ruler, the one who comes to Jesus and who has done so much. What must I do to be saved? And Jesus wanted him to understand that in his sin there was nothing he could do. It's a powerful story. It is impossible for sinners to accomplish salvation through their own efforts. But righteousness accounted to us by the work of God by faith. It's only possible through God. This is one of the clearest expressions in the Bible of the truth of salvation by grace through faith. It is the first time believe is used in the Bible, and the first time righteousness is used in the Bible. This is the New Testament gospel in the Hebrew Scriptures, later quoted 4 times in the New Testament. All right? God's promise fulfilling in his testing of Abraham. We read through this together in Seamless, and there's that powerful story of Abraham waiting for a son to come. How did that go? Did he wait perfectly for that? No, he kind of fouled it up real good, right? Hagar, and it wasn't just all him alone, him and his wife just got ahead of themselves. We see that God is faithful. Did God eventually bring the son? Yes, we read that. We read that story of Isaac. And then you have that incredible story of faith where God tells him to take your only son and sacrifice him in an act of worship. Does Abraham hesitate? No. He gets up and he goes. You remember? Isaac's like, where's the lamb? What's he say to his son? God will provide the lamb. I love how she points out in the book, what was caught in the thicket? Was a lamb or was it a ram? God provided a ram for that sacrifice because one day that lamb was coming. I love that. She did a beautiful job with that in the book. Think about the parallels between Abraham and Isaac and God the Father and Jesus. Both are long-awaited beloved sons, born in miraculous circumstances. Both carry wood that is to be the instrument of their deaths on their backs. In both stories, the father leads the son up the mountain, and the son follows obediently toward his own death. And in both scenarios, God provides the sacrificial substitute, which Abraham says will be a ram, a male lamb, and the New Testament identifies Jesus as the Lamb of God. What do all these parallels mean? Abraham and Isaac, beyond themselves, point to a deliverer. This story is a prophetic reenactment of the greater redemption God would someday accomplish through one of Abraham and Isaac's descendants, Jesus. An exchange happens in Exodus 22. The ram goes in the place of Isaac. This points to the greater exchange that happens on the cross to the Son of God in the place of humanity. In Jesus, God brings his own promised Son unto death and through death. And just like God spares Isaac, God spares humanity because he takes the cross on himself. But the interesting thing is it's 400 years between Jacob's family entering Egypt into Exodus 1. And so I asked the question, why? Why is it 400 years? What in the world is God doing? So I want to read to you, before I jump into the whole notebook, I want to read to you Genesis 15, 13 through 16. That brings a little understanding what God is doing. It says, the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there. And they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve. And afterward, they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So all the way back in Genesis 15, God is telling what's going to happen. And then he gives you two good reasons. The first one, actually three, so they're going to be sent to that land. But it says that you are going to come out with great possessions. So a lot needed to happen in Egypt, and a lot needed to happen to get them there and get them prepared for them to plunder Egypt. They needed a lot of gold to make that silly bull that they made that they all tried to worship and bow down before. And the other one that I find very interesting, and people point out that God is so angry. God's always crushing these people and that people. And I want to point you to verse 16. I think is powerful. And they shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Ammonites is not yet complete. God gave them 400 years to turn to him. You think that's patient? Don't you think they heard what God was doing? What God's people were all about, especially as they came out of Egypt. And then we get into that Joshua phase here in 2 weeks. The time had not yet come. God had given those people 400 years to turn to him. I love that. The time was not ready. God had 400 years, not only to prepare his people, to prepare a leader, to prepare a nation to be plundered, and for people to continue to toil away in the sin to the point that they have to be dealt with. But God allowed 400 years for them to turn, if they could and they wanted to. So, the top of your page, 500 years passes from Abraham to Exodus. We see that Israel increased in population and riches. 70 people walked in. They say about 2 million left. They were busy. There's a lot going on in Egypt. It says in Exodus chapter 1, verse 7, but the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. That's putting it mildly. From 70 to 2,000. To 2 million. It says that Israel became slaves in Egypt. Verse 9. The people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And a war breaks out, and they join the enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them, just as God told Abraham back in chapter 15. Number 3, Pharaoh commanded that the newborn sons be killed by the Hebrew wives. I love the Hebrew wives. Oh yeah. These ladies are awesome. Verse 16. They're told that as a male child is born, again, remember, there's an enemy out there trying to stop the coming deliverer. So it's no surprise when they're in Egypt and they're multiplying like crazy that the Pharaoh wants to kill the male heirs. Verse 16, this is when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool. And if it's a son, you shall kill them. But the midwives let the male children live. I can but only obey God. I can but only follow God. And those little babies are very important and precious to God. Pharaoh's command is consistent with Satan's plan of Jew hatred through the centuries as an attack against God's deliverer and plan of redemption. Satan knew that the deliverer, the seed of the woman, the one who would crush his head, would come from the children of Israel. Therefore, he tried to destroy the whole nation in one generation by ordering all the male children to be killed. You got to have that kind of perspective as you're reading. God's hand, God's providence, God's promises being fulfilled. At the very same time, there's someone trying to stop it the whole way. So as the offense is taking the ball down the field, there's a defense who's trying to stop and pick off as many people as possible. God's offense is not going to lose. Hasn't lost yet. Satan thinks he's going to get there and he's going to stop it somehow. Next, we see that God would keep his promises and preserve Israel. It says in verse 12, the more that they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more that they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. We see that God's people were set free by his hand, leading them by a pillar of cloud and fire. Exodus 13:21, and the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart from the people. Not only are you seeing 2 million people travel through the wilderness, but in the middle of all of them is either a fire cloud or a smoke cloud that has no reasonable explanation. That reasonable explanation to us is God. God was doing his work. God was leading his people, and he's still doing it. I love it. So here's the fun one. Moses, what tribe is he from? If you know it, throw it out. Say it loud. Levi. Very good. So is Moses in the line of Jesus? No. I feel like God's playing a shell game, right? God knows exactly who it is and how it's going to get there. And we have glimpses and pictures of that pop up. And it hits in a big way when David hits the scene. The first king, I'm getting way ahead of myself. I'll stop. I love this stuff so much. Let's talk about the Mosaic covenant, God's covenant with his people and Moses. We see that God continues to remain faithful. He brought them out as he heard. He heard their cry. He sent Moses as a deliverer. God defeated Pharaoh, Satan the enemy, and the gods of Egypt. All those plagues match up with the gods of Egypt. I love it. And God provided food and water amidst all of the constant grumbling. If you're a parent and you've made dinner and your kid turns up their nose, how frustrating is that? But God provided everything for the people. They're like, I don't want manna anymore. That special cereal from heaven. I don't want quail anymore. All that grumbling. But did God stop in his faithfulness? No. God was still faithful through the whole way. God lifted them up. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 11, it says, like an eagle that stirs up its nest and hovers above its young and spreads its wings to catch them and carries them on its pinions. That is God's work in his people. They were in Egypt. Things were not great, but they were comfortable there. He stirred up the nest and he hovers and brings them out. And as crazy as they're going to be and problems they're going to cause, God upholds them through all that time in the wilderness. And he loves to use those kind of pictures. We see that the next thing is that God is drawing them close. Of all that was done so God could be close to his people, despite all the complaining and grumbling, God draws near. All he has to work with are sinful people. And he chose this family, this nation, and he brought them out and provided. And now he draws close to them. Middle square on the left side, God plans an agreement with his people. Exodus chapter 19, verse 5. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the people, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. These are the words you shall speak to the people of Israel. God will bless Israel if they will obey him perfectly. They must do everything he will tell them. He will accept them, and they will prosper in every area of their lives. Do they do a good job of this? No. Because they're all sinners just like us. They all struggle just like us. But is God faithful? Absolutely. So Israel promises to obey everything. And all the people answered together, Exodus chapter 19, verse 8, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And Moses reported the words of all the people to the Lord. And God's like, yeah, I know you're going to try. But he knows what's going to happen. Next, we see that God displays his holiness and his righteousness to his people. Next to verse 9 and 10. And the Lord said to Moses, behold, I'm coming to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you, and maybe also believe you forever. When Moses told the words to the people, to the Lord said to Moses, go to the people, consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their garments and be ready for the third day. For on the third day the Lord will come down from the mountain on the sight of the people. That third day. God is going to meet with his people. He's going to tabernacle. He's going to be with his people. Bottom row, left-hand side, God's holiness meant that there needed to be certain precautions to protect people. Verse 12, and you shall set limits for the people all around, saying, take care not to go up to the mountain or touch the edge Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. No hands shall touch him, but he shall be stoned or shot, whether beast or man, he shall not live. And when the trumpet sounds a long blast, they shall come to the mountain. God's holiness is going to be clearly established here. If he's going to live in the midst of his people, he wants his people to understand how serious and how holy he truly is. And then we see that God communicates to the people. Exodus 20, verse 1, and God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the houses of slavery. It's like a reintroduction. I'm the one who brought you out. I want you to understand who I am. I love you. I led you out. I'm going to provide you. I'm going to take care of you. No one else could do this for you. I am your God. And then we find that God gives his commands to his people. And it's not a way for the people to be right with God, right? It's not a list of rules that if they just follow it, they'll be accepted by God. These laws, these rules that God gives them can only bring conviction of sin, can show them how far short they fall to a holy God. They force us, the laws force us to seek mercy from a very patient God. The example of Israel's experience in the wilderness warns us what can happen to people who hear God's words and see his words but do not come to faith.